Around the world, women from indigenous communities are often most at risk of being displaced, attacked, harmed, and killed. In North America today, this pattern is no different. Right now in Canada, violence against Native First Nations women has become a national crisis. Across the country, they've gone missing and been murdered by the thousands. To avoid this fate, many have fled the widespread violence on the reserves, but what we're finding is that for Indigenous women, no place is safe.
This is the Tachi Reserve. It's one of several Tlasden Nation communities situated in north-central British Columbia, about 10 hours north of Vancouver. We are here at a scene that's all too common in this part of the country, a search party for a missing First Nations woman.
Search all over this area right there, all the way down on the side of the road and come back down. And down this cove there, send somebody down there. Yeah. They never come up with nothing.
Immaculate Mackie Basil was 26 when she went missing in 2013.
These guys behind me have been searching for Mackie for the last 2 years since she went missing.
Right now in Canada, there's a lot of women that are going missing, and especially Indigenous women. And it's like they say, it's 4 times higher than the national average. Not that any woman should go missing, but it seems to be there is some sort of epidemic going on right now in Canada.
Canadian law enforcement estimates that 1,200 Native women throughout Canada have disappeared or been murdered since 1980. But some independent reports place that number closer to 4,000.
So are you looking for an article of clothing?
Shallow grave, anything out of the usual.
Mackie was last seen heading home after a night of drinking with 2 male friends.
Apparently everybody just assumed that one way or another she had made it back to the village and she either went to town or to Prince George.
The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, conducted an extensive search, but after just 4 days, they called it off.
If they can't find any evidence of missing person, then they have to call off their assistance. And then it's left up to the community after that to organize themselves.
What do you think could have happened?
Everybody's got a version to try to unravel the puzzle to find out where Mackie is, and we just can't do it.
Mackie's family knows that the odds of closure are low, but they keep searching. It's all they can do. Meanwhile, First Nations women continue to disappear, their cases often going unnoticed outside the community. But in August 2014, police made an especially grisly discovery: the body of a missing First Nations girl wrapped in a plastic bag, floating in Canada's Red River.
The tragic death of 15-year-old First Nations girl Tina Fontaine has renewed calls for a public probe.
International organizations, including the United Nations, have called for a national public inquiry.
Despite the outcry, the Canadian government, at that time led by Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper, never launched an inquiry. This phenomenon is affecting thousands of First Nations families. I wanted to hear from the women on the Tachi Reserve who live with this reality every day about why they think it's happening.
I'm just curious to know how many of you have people you know who have gone missing or been murdered.
Yep. Oh, yeah. My sister was murdered by her boyfriend. She experienced physical violence before she was murdered, but nobody really knew that she was a victim until the night she got murdered.
How many of you have been victims of sexual violence? All of you. And would you say by members of your own community or by...
Yes.
Yeah. I just want to know why you think Native women, Indigenous women are targeted.
Because of residential school, there was a lot of physical abuse. There was a lot of violence. I mean, we are all products of residential school.
Residential schools were government-sponsored, church-run boarding schools for Indigenous children. Kids were taken away from their parents and forcibly assimilated into white culture. Sexual and physical abuse were widespread. The last residential school didn't close until 1996. By that time, 150,000 First Nations children had gone through the system.
When the residential school, the first wave that were coming back, the young men were already physically abused, sexually abused, and they were angry. The family structure was obliterated.
Longtime Native health and wellness advocate Mary T.G. explains how the violence inflicted on children in residential schools made its way back to the reserve.
If you're living in a home where there is violence, you're more likely to be violent as well. So then you have all of those multi-generational effects. And because of all the abuses, there is a higher rate of violence against women within our communities.
Thousands of First Nations women have been murdered and gone missing across Canada. They are also the victims of violence in their homes and communities. As a result, Native women don't feel safe or happy. And that leads to some dangerous choices.
If you're unhappy at home, if your life is not good at home, that's what I did. I hitchhiked. Got on the road and I left and I ran away.
And with all the abuse and the violence that happens within the home, you don't feel like you're connected or you have family to turn to, so you just do things on your own because you really do feel isolated.
Anywhere is better than home. You just want to get out, you know.
Yeah.
You take all kinds of risks and you go.
The threat of violence often drives Native women off the reserve and onto the road. But in such a remote region, with no transportation, they're forced to hitchhike.
This highway is called the Highway of Tears, Highway 16, named that way for the number of girls who have gone missing. When I think of hitchhiking, I freak out. Literally every single person I spoke to today had hitchhiked, knowing that they're vulnerable, knowing that they're compromised, knowing that they may be targeted, but there's no other way.
Despite these risks, many First Nations women will try to flee the cycle of abuse, often making the almost 600-mile journey to Vancouver for a fresh start.
Some of our young girls are leaving their communities to get a better life, but also to become safe. They're escaping the pain from being abused, be it sexually or physically abused, and that's sort of what they're leaving. And so they end up in the downtown east side.
This is Vancouver's infamous downtown east side neighborhood. It's sometimes referred to as the largest reserve in Canada because of its massive First Nations population. The area is notorious for homelessness, drugs, and prostitution. As many as 70% of the sex workers here are Indigenous.
When they are working in the streets, leading that high-risk lifestyle, they are escaping from something, and usually they're self-medicating to get drugs, and how do they get that? Is by sex trade work or survival sex trade.
We passed a lot of First Nations women. I can see why they call it the largest reserve. I mean, it really is shocking how many people are just living out here on the sidewalk, just homeless and tweaked out, and bags of drugs and people shooting needles and sharing needles and smoking pipes. It's bleak.
Bernie Williams, the founder of Sacred Circle, a community center for at-risk women, spends every night walking the streets looking for women in need of her help.
I work at 11:30 at night, and I don't get off till 7:30 in the morning. So when I see these women going out, making the choices, sometimes they're not their choices. Some of them are pushed into it. Some of them are forced. Some of them are sold, with human trafficking that we hear very little about, but it's very real down here. I try to help them, with services that they need. I've learned to be a great listener, and that's a huge thing for them. Even that touch, just to say, hey, how are you doing?
How did you end up in Vancouver doing the work that you do?
My mother was murdered November 5th, 1977 in the downtown east side. 2 of my sisters were also murdered. I could have easily been one of the victims.
And the murderers of your mother and your sisters, were they caught?
No.
Why do all of these cases they just go unsolved?
They don't matter. They don't matter at all. They're just another Indian. They always say, the only good Indian is a dead Indian, and that still exists. This young woman here, she was a tree planter. This woman was one of my clients. Her name is Angelina. Still missing.
Even if they can escape abuse on the reserve, First Nations women are finding themselves even more vulnerable in Canada's cities. The epidemic of missing and murdered First Nations women isn't confined to Canada's reserves. Here on the downtown east side of Vancouver, Indigenous women are in constant danger.
How many women have gone missing from the downtown east side?
Well, the ones that are accounted for 69, we believe that there's at least over 200, maybe more. We spoke to many women. When you sit with them, in the alleys or when they share their stories.
Women who are prostituting?
Yes, and when you hear them share their stories, it's all the same over and over.
Hi.
We met two women living on the sidewalk in front of Sacred Circle named Crystal and Chanel.
I just came to stay with my friend, Crystal. This is our little home.
Can I take a peek in? Do you mind?
Yeah, go for it.
You don't mind?
Take a look.
Might do some stuff. Take a little bed.
When you're all cuddled up in there and it's nice and warm.
It drops pretty cold though out
Body
here.
heat's the best.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you guys feel like you really don't have anywhere to go, except for Bernie.
She's wonderful.
And you're First Nations. I read that 70% of the women who are out working on the streets are Indigenous. Do you see a fair amount of First Nation women?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I see more First Nations women out working down here on the downtown east side than white Caucasian girls.
But I do see a lot of the violence with the Native women out here. A lot.
Like many homeless women on the downtown east side, Crystal and Chanel are addicted to drugs.
So when was the last time you used?
10 minutes ago.
And what kind of drugs are you using now?
I use heroin now, and sometimes crystal meth.
Are you working right now?
I'm escorting.
I don't work myself. I go and I spot for her.
While I was there, Chanel actually had to leave to meet a client.
How do you feel when she's out there working?
It's scary. I'm scared for her because there could be a time where she doesn't come back, and I don't want that. And I have a friend that's missing right now, actually, and I don't want that to happen to this friend, but I'm scared for her when she goes.
The women out here that you've met, they're all aware of these murdered and missing girls. Is this something that everyone knows?
Yeah, they all know. They all, they're very aware that they could be them.
Do a lot of women end up prostituting because
that is your only option. Sometimes there's nowhere else to go, nobody to turn to, nobody to help you. So what do? You gotta go sell yourself to the devil, I guess they call it, just survive.
These high-risk lifestyles make First Nations women easy targets.
Some guys brag around downtown here, how easy it is to kill a First Nations woman. And they have no conscience over it because we are filth to them. We are dirty to them. We are less than. Nobody would even miss us if we were gone because we just basically don't really exist down here.
I wanted to understand where such extreme racism comes from.
So this street here used to be a quick escape route.
I was able to meet up with Daniel Gallant, a reformed white supremacist who spent years on the downtown east side preying on First Nations people.
This area's a lot of First Nations people. I've shot, I've stabbed, I've beat people with baseball bats, shovels, chains, propane bottles, vehicles. I could go on and on.
Did you ever kill anyone?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know.
Why were you targeting First Nations people?
If it was really easy to To believe that they were a plague on society, that they were leeching off of the white Canadian, that they were lazy, they didn't want to work, and they were just useless people filled with social sickness, and they had to be gone.
Did you get away with a lot?
I got away with most of the stuff I did. I can't say exactly, but I think I had 12 or 13 charges in total, and I had about 6 or 7 convictions. And I never did actual jail time.
Do you think that's because you're white?
The very fact that I can talk about this stuff publicly, if I was First Nations, I wouldn't have the privilege of saying what I say. I think our society in general doesn't value Indigenous people. That's why we see what we're seeing. The amount of murdered and missing women is a structural issue, and I think is ingrained in our values as a society.
According to Daniel, ingrained racism against Natives has opened the door to the deadly violence here on the downtown east side. It's also the one thing keeping these women from finding justice.
If there were, say, 1,600 missing white women, wouldn't we have already had an inquiry by now? It's an issue that all Canadian citizens should be aware of. You can't live in a society where we talk about we're in first world in Canada, but yet our First Nations people are living in second, third world country. I think every Canadian should be upset. I think every Canadian should be saying, I can't believe this is happening in the first world country, Canada.
Canada's First Nations women are under assault everywhere they turn. But many believe the road to change starts within the community itself.
You wanted honey, right?
Joe and Joyce Fasella have lived together for 48 years.
Way up there.
And for many of those years, Joyce suffered severe emotional and physical abuse at the hands of her husband. Today, Joe and Joyce run Warriors Against Violence, a group that works with First Nations men and women to end domestic violence.
I was spiraling out of control real fast. I tried to kill my wife in our 24th year of marriage. What we've all learned as men, that the men are the kings of the castles. I heard my dad tell my mom, and I told my wife, if you ever leave me, I'm gonna hunt you down and I'm gonna kill you. She says, either I change my ways or this relationship's over. That scared the hell out of me. Where'd she find the courage to talk to me like that?
As a victim myself, I know that one of the best things I did for me was to get the help and, empowering myself. It still didn't stop him from being abusive, but he kind of held back on the physical part of it. But the other damage that was done is there. It probably will be there for some time. And I think you all come to that point in life when you say, I've had enough.
I had a girlfriend that I used to hit back in the day. I will never, ever behave in that way again. I don't want any man ever treat my daughters the way that I may have treated women. Because maybe that violent side comes up on me again. I don't want any man treating my mother with disrespect, right? I was raised better than that, right?
Be good to each other. Be good to yourselves. We're all fragile people. Thank you for coming and spending time with us. All my relations.
Community efforts like these are the first step towards changing the culture of violence. But change also has to happen at the highest levels. In June of 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released a report calling the government's forced assimilation of Indigenous children into residential schools a cultural genocide. Later that year, Canadians elected Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. One of his top priorities was addressing the issue of missing and murdered First Nations women by launching a national inquiry.
The constitutionally guaranteed rights of First Nations in Canada are not an inconvenience, but a sacred obligation.
We know that we have issues of poverty, we know we have issues of violence against women, but it will be our solutions coming from our cultural perspective that is going to propel us forward to get over these horrible atrocities. But we also need to look at the role of the government. It's got to be a collaborative effort, and then only then can we have true reconciliation.
The recent steps taken by the Trudeau government signal a major shift in the fight for justice for First Nations women. But the problem may be greater than any one law or politician can solve. We need to address the violence at its source. Until systemic racism is recognized, until there is a national effort around this cause, the Indigenous women of Canada will never be safe.